So we're going to jump right in because I don't want to delay the hour in allowing you to hear from our fantastic guest. As I normally do, I want to share with you who's coming up next week and on Friday, February 19th for our VodCast from 11 to 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We have Sean Harvey. And in that VodCast, we're going to be discussing developing the next generation of soul-inspired bridge builders, facilitators, and leaders equipped to form authentic and purpose-driven communities. And so Sean has a very unique approach to this work. And I look forward to you all being able to have a chance to hear from him. And then following that week, we also have on February 26th, another great VodCast that's scheduled and planned. It's going to be hosted by Natasha Porizkova. And we're having as our guest co-hosts, Michael Stevens and Malayas. And pronounce her last name for me, Natasha. I don't want to butcher it.
I believe it's Jakalu.
Jakalu, fantastic. Yes, awesome. And so we're going to be in that particular VodCast unpacking identity, mental health, and managing well-being at the intersection. So really look forward to that conversation as well. It's going to be rich. I know something that's top of mind for each of us as we're having to be very diligent about practicing our self-care. So I look forward to that. Now, I am super excited to announce for the first time that Nika White Consulting is going to be offering another book club this year. For those of you who've been a part of this community, you know we've done a book club in the past. We have Minda Harts, the author of The Memo, How to Secure a Seat. And she also has released some new books, by the way, just to provide that accolade to her. But we have Karen Catlin that's going to be joining us for our spring book club. And she's going to be with us 2 evenings, April the 22nd, as well as April the 29th from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to talk about what's in her book, Better Ally. She just released a second edition of that book. We had her on as a guest co-host for the VodCast a couple weeks back. And so I'm super excited to welcome her for that discussion. And we will place into the chat a link for you to register so you can go ahead and secure your spot for that. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest co-host today, Joe Gerstandt. He is a speaker, author, and advisor bringing greater clarity, action, and impact to organizational diversity and inclusion efforts. Joe has worked with Fortune 100 corporations, small nonprofits, government entities, and everything in between. He speaks at numerous conferences and summits and is a featured contributor for the Workforce Diversity Network Expert Forum. His insights have been published in Diversity Best Practices, Diversity Executive, HR Executive, numerous other print and online journals, and he co-authored the book, Social Gravity, Harnessing the Natural Laws of Relationships. Joe serves on the Intersectional Culture and Diversity Advisory Council for the social networking platform Twitter, has served on the U.S. Technical Advisory Group's Diversity and Inclusion Working Group within the International Organization for Standardization, and is currently on the board of directors for the Tri-Faith Initiative, which brings together into permanent residency a synagogue, church, and mosque, and interfaith center on one 38-acre campus in the middle of America's heartland. Can't wait to hear more about that. By its very model, it challenges people of faith and goodwill to be conscious and proactive about the assets of faith and civil life in religiously pluralistic society. Tri-Faith Initiative aims to create a more inclusive culture in which religious pluralism is socially normative. So help me welcome in your own way, for those of you who are joined with us, just by maybe some words of just positive affirmation to Joe into the chat. Hi, my friend. How are you? Thanks so much for being here with us today. Super excited to share this space with you.
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. So one of the things that we normally do is to just jumpstart the conversation by having our guest host to share with us their story, things about them that we wouldn't be able to read about in his or her bio. And so I would love for you just to take a moment to share your story with us. How have you gotten to the place where you are now and the work that you do?
That's not a short story, but I'll try to give you a short version of it. I'll say that a lot of things had to change for me to find this work and see the work the way that I do. If we rolled the tape back 30 years, I was in a very different place on a lot of the topics and issues in this work. I'm originally a farm kid from Northwest Iowa and had a pretty narrow view of the world and my role in it, I guess I would say. But went out into the world and bumped into people that were different than I was. And sometimes I was able to learn from those exchanges. I spent some time in the Marine Corps Went to college, spent some time in corporate America, and because I was professionally unhappy, I was looking to make kind of a career change. And I ended up getting a job for a nonprofit organization called Nebraska AIDS Project, which, among other things, does HIV prevention and education work. And I think when I went into that work, which was very different than the work that I had done before, when I went into that work, I think I thought I was open-minded, progressive, those kinds of things. And I was really just getting started. I would say everything in my life changed while I worked for that organization. My view of the world changed, my view of our community changed, my view of myself changed. And that was where I turned the corner and started moving towards this work. It was a few years later before I got actively involved in workplace diversity and inclusion work, but that was kind of the big turning point. Profound learning experience, mostly because of the people that I was around and working with and working on behalf of. So inclusion is a journey, and it's been a long journey for me. Like I said, a lot of things had to change here and here for me to come to this work. So.
No, that's great, Joe. And so I have to ask this question. For those of you who aren't familiar with Joe, you don't have a full visual to him. But when Joe and I first met years ago, I was so taken by his approach to this work. First and foremost, I was really enthralled with a white male leader leveraging his voice and place of privilege to be able to bring about great insights and education around this broad topic. And that really appealed to me. And not only was it a white male doing it, but it was a bald head white male with tattoos all over his body, and that became a part of your story. And so I am interested to hear, did you find that as you were gravitating to this space and beginning to work in this space, Joe, were you met with any resistance for people really questioning, what do you know about this work of DEI? Was that ever a question or a conversation?
A little bit. It's close to 20 years ago that I got started, and there weren't very many white male folks. There's still not a lot of white male folks in this work. I bumped into that a little bit, but I think the thing that I wasn't aware of initially, but I became aware of, is that much more so than that, even doing this work, I benefit from a tremendous amount of privilege. I get invited into places and I get heard in a way that a lot of my peers aren't. And I haven't always been aware of that. I am aware of that now, and I try to be very intentional about using that when I'm invited into those spaces. One of the most valuable learning experiences I had pretty early on when I went out on my own was I got invited by a healthcare system to come and spend some time with their senior leadership team. And we ended up doing a bunch of things, but the focus was a half-hour presentation to this senior leadership team, seven men, 5 white men and 2 African-American men. And I was very prepared for this conversation, and I went in there and I crushed it. And they told me so. They said fantastic things, wonderful things. They loved it, valuable, made sense. And I wanted to believe them. I thought what they were saying was very good. The woman that hired me to do that work, their vice president of HR, not on the executive leadership team. At the end of that day, her and I went out to have dinner, and we had a great conversation. And at the end of that conversation, she said to me, "You did a great job for us today. I also need you to know that you didn't say anything to those men that I hadn't said to them before." Right? When I walked out of that room that day, all I could see was my own talent. And hopefully I took a little bit of talent into that room, but that wasn't the only thing at play. If I would have been thinking about my privilege, I probably would have said a couple of other things that I should have said to that senior leadership team. Even doing this work, I sometimes get heard in a way that some of my peers don't get heard. And so I think, especially as a straight white middle-aged guy doing this work, I have to make sure that I'm telling the truth, that I'm not watering this down, that I'm not making it too easy or convenient for folks. And it's not always clear where that line is, but I think I really have to keep that privilege in front of me, because when you're on the advantage side of things, it's kind of easy to not see it. It's like when you're riding the bike with the wind at your back. It's kind of easy to think you're in better shape than you thought you were, but there's other things in play.
Yeah, privilege is often invisible to those who have it, but I'm grateful for your self-awareness and the influence that you've been able to provide in the work that you do in this space. So I want to yield to my colleague, Natasha, who also has some questions for you, Joe.
Yes. Hey, Joe. I wanted to ask, so I wonder what barriers have you hit being a white straight man in this work. For some, they invite it, but for others, they think that, white men shouldn't be a part of the conversation. And how have you taken that as it comes to inclusion and tackling this work?
I wouldn't say that I bumped into a lot of barriers. There is a conversation sometimes that it's problematic for a privileged person to be paid to do this work. And I can't entirely dismiss that conversation. Every time I bump up against that narrative, I have to sit down and think about it. And I don't know that it's wrong. I don't know that it's incorrect. I'm going to continue to do the work. I think I have a contribution to make, but I do carry that idea with me, and I think it's one of the things that I hold on to make sure that I am having an impact, that I am using my privilege, but I do have to reflect on that sometimes. I can't automatically say that they're wrong or that is incorrect. That's a narrative out there among some people, but I wouldn't say that I've run into a lot of challenges or barriers.
And I'm sure it makes you a more astute practitioner, keeping that in mind and being intentional about that work because you have that in the forefront of your thoughts. But moving on to another question I had for you was, if you could you illustrate, so you talk about the active inclusion versus the experience of being included. Could you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think one of the most valuable things that an organization can do if they're doing this work is to make sure they have a common language in place, and most organizations simply don't. We are increasingly today talking about things like diversity and inclusion and equity. The problem is we're throwing the same words back and forth. None of us are talking about the same thing. And so I think it's really important that organizations spend a little bit of time thinking and arguing about, when we say diversity, when we say inclusion, when we say equity, what specifically do we mean? I think that makes our conversations more meaningful and actionable, but also makes it easier to pick the right goals and the right metrics and the right targets. So I think it's an important part of this work. And when I'm talking to people about inclusion, I ask them to think about it in two different ways. The active process of change, the things that we do to be more inclusive, behaviors, practices, policies, and also think about what that experiential outcome is. What does it mean to be fully included in your organization? What does that look like, feel like, sound like? How do we know when it's happening? How do we know when it's not happening? If we're committed to this work, that's our product. That's the product that we're trying to deliver, a more consistently inclusive experience. And if it's our product, we should be able to explain it. We should be able to speak to its characteristics just like we do with our other products. But most organizations don't have that language. They haven't sat down and thought about that. And so it makes me kind of question how they pick their strategies and their tactics, because they haven't gotten clarity on what the outcome is, what the product is. It's not fun, exciting work. You've got to argue about words and think about words, but I think it's incredibly important work. And still, in my experience, it's missing inside most organizations. You can find today organizations saying big, beautiful, poetic things about inclusion, but they can't tell you what it is. And if you can't tell me what it is, I'm not sure what to do with your statement of commitment. I'm not sure what it actually means. So I think spending time putting that foundational language in place is a really valuable thing. I think it makes everything a little bit more efficient and a little bit easier moving forward.
I just want to say, Lenroy in the chat says, say that again. So he is very much in support of all of what you just said.
Yeah, no, that's really critical. Common language is key. So as I was sharing your bio, we talked about your work in the interfaith, and there's lots of people into the chat that are really intrigued by that, and they want you just to spend some time talking about it further. So elaborate on what that body of work is exactly and why it's important to you.
Yeah, so I'm involved with the Tri-Faith Initiative, and it's not even fair to say that I've done interfaith work. I'm on the board. I've been a fan for a while. I'm kind of a new member to the board, but it's a pretty amazing organization. It's based here I'm in Omaha, Nebraska. I don't know if I mentioned that or not, which I like to refer to as the middle of everywhere. And the weather is so horrible today. I won't even talk about it. It's offensively cold here. But we have this very cool story here. We have this beautiful campus that has a church and a mosque and a synagogue on it with a Tri-Faith Center. And there's this ongoing active relationship between these three congregations. And the story behind it is really beautiful. It goes back to 9/11. In Omaha, in the days after 9/11, there was a group of Jewish leaders from one of the local temples that gathered together and locked arms around the mosque in Omaha. And that act led to an ongoing conversation that all of these years later led to this beautiful organization and this beautiful effort. And there's cool things going on here locally among those 3 congregations, but this is also an organization that is starting to share programming with the rest of the world. They're starting to tackle some workplace stuff. They're trying to educate people on religious pluralism and religion in general. I think religion and faith is another one of those things that many of us are not very well educated on outside of our own experience, outside of our own religious affiliation. So I think it's an organization that's got profound potential. We seem to be in many ways divided and fractured in this country, and I think that this is an organization that can build some bridges in pretty powerful and profound ways. I encourage you to check out their website. Again, it's not just local efforts; they're also doing things beyond that. It's the Tri-Faith Initiative. Great organization, great people, and I'm kind of a new active member.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we have some teammates that are supporting us backstage today with the NWC team, Lauren Takei, as well as Lindsay Morton. So we're going to have them to place that into the chat. So for those who are interested in learning more, and there it is. Actually, Natasha has it in there already. That's great. That's fantastic. I want to go back to something you said before, and I'm seeing that there's some people in this community that's really interested in unpacking it. I too have heard a little bit bubbling up around people in those positions of dominant majority and influence and privilege and power that are in this space, the whole notion of whether or not they should be getting paid for it. And I'm going to share my thoughts. And I just, because I'm curious about this, I have heard that too, and I've been somewhat bothered by it in some regards. While I can understand the reason that it's starting to bubble up, I'm also of the firm belief that it's important for those of us who are practitioners in this space to be, and we talked about this, to be protective about this space from a sense of we want to make sure a high level of credence is given to the discipline because this is important work. And I tend to believe that it doesn't make you a more astute DEI practitioner based upon who you are. Some of the most astute practitioners that I know are part of the dominant culture. In fact, my mentor in this space is part of the dominant culture. But what makes her so astute at her role is her keen ability to realize that what she doesn't know, and then to surround herself with people that can bring that lens and that perspective to the conversation. So I'm not a big fan, to be honest with you, of there being this amplified conversation of people not being able to, regardless of who they are, to see this as a career path that is deserving and should be commensurate with the value and the experience and the time that's being placed. So that's my take on it. I would love to just get some additional dialogue going on this.
And I think it is an interesting conversation. And again, as someone in that position, I have a hard time dismissing it. I think it's something that I have to pay attention to and wrestle with. Yeah. I also know that one of the things that I've increasingly focused on in recent years is trying to have very candid conversations with white male leaders, and using my own story as part of that conversation, being very honest about the fact that at this point in my life, these are the things that I said and believed. Even though I didn't think I was racist and sexist and homophobic, I had these beliefs and these ideas and these behaviors. And this is what happened that made me think differently. This is how this changed. Sharing some of that story, none of which is good stuff. It's all stuff I'm not super proud of, but it's true stuff. In the hopes that it's going to make them feel a little bit safer, being honest about the fact that they also came from somewhere. They also absorbed some things growing up. They picked up some ideas and some attitudes and beliefs from the people around them, and they've had some experiences since then. I think if you're going to be creative and courageous about being on this journey, you have to be honest about where you've come and what your journey has been like so far. And I think a lot of folks don't want to do that. So that's one of the ways in which I use my own identity and my own story to hopefully invite more of my peers, middle-aged straight white men, to think about the impact of where they've come from and where they're at today so that they can think about moving forward.
And that's huge. We need that. We need that. And so I appreciate you elaborating further on that. I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, certainly make sure you're placing them into the chat. We are curating those, and we will at some point in time soon shift to the questions that you have. Also want to acknowledge the live Facebook audience that are joined with us here today as well. If you have comments, make sure that you're using the comment area, and we're bringing that into the conversation as well. So Natasha, you want to take us to maybe some additional questions that you have?
Yes. So I would love, Joe, if you could talk about what you personally do to proactively invite and center differences as both an individual and when you work with organizations. So how do you go about centering those differences and inviting the difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in my personal life, at some point, I became aware of the fact that people that were different than I was, that had different experiences, had really valuable information to share with me, both in their own experience so that I could learn about that, and in their view of me, what they saw in my behaviors. Most of the learnings that I had early in my life happened by accident. I bumped into people and I made mistakes, and some of them were very kind and forgiving and patient people, and they taught me and they coached me and they supported me. But at some point I became very intentional about seeking out difference. I wanted to grow my network, but not just in number. I also wanted to be riddled with diversity, because I know the more difference exists in my networks of relationships, the more accurate my understanding of the world is going to be. I'm going to have access to a lot of different stories, a lot of different lenses, a lot of different data. And so I became very intentional. I remain very intentional about having a lot of diversity in my network of relationships. Doing the work that I do, that has become pretty easy. I have a really diverse network of relationships because a lot of the people that I know, a lot of my friends are fellow practitioners. It's a pretty diverse group of folks. I think there's some other simple things. At some point in my life, I became very intentional about what I read, what stories I sought out, what movies I sought out. Was I seeking out difference and variety? I was one of those people that said, when it comes to authors, I don't really care about things like race and gender. And I thought that was true, but if you looked at my bookshelf, it would appear that that mattered greatly, because they were pretty much all white men. And there's some other people out there that think that way as well. And so I became intentional about changing that. That's a really easy way to get started. And we live in a time in which we have access to so many stories. Netflix will do the work for you. Like you can leave your comfort zone and get some insight into other people's experiences and communities and lives from the comfort of your own home. It can't always be an academic adventure. At some point you have to go out in the world and be with people, but you can get started really easily and really safely. Movies and documentaries and books and websites and podcasts. There's a ton of great podcasts out there that will expose you to an experience different than yours. And that's a really valuable thing. I think some of the most valuable stuff that happened to me was when and this was back when I was doing HIV prevention work, I found myself almost always in the minority, and oftentimes visibly in the minority, which was a new experience for me. And it's not a new experience for many people. For some people, it's normal. It's every day. But if you've never had that experience before, I think it's easy to not appreciate that that's a different way to be in a space. Like, it feels different. So I think a lot of it is about continuing to leave your comfort zone, like relentlessly leaving your comfort zone, which isn't easy. We talk a great game about it. I think we don't oftentimes do it. Go to different places. You will know you found a different place when you feel some discomfort. There's a reason you haven't gone to those places yet. Based on my experience, if you follow your discomfort, your world and your network will fill with difference, and it will be authentic and organic, just like your other relationships are. The second part of the question was, how do we center difference in the workplace? So one of the things that I really like to start with focusing in the workplace is paying attention to our relationship with disagreement. Disagreement is a great proxy for diversity, because it's one of the ways in which difference manifests between people. The more different we are, the more difference, the more points of disagreement and tension and conflict are. If we really value diversity, if we really value difference, we should have a healthy, proactive, intentional relationship with disagreement. We should be able to do disagreement well. Most organizations don't have that ability, so they avoid telling the truth to each other. So I like to do things very simple, very tactical things about making sure that we force ourselves to practice disagreeing in our meetings, making sure that we've talked about what that looks like. What is healthy disagreement versus unhealthy disagreement? What are our ground rules? What are the terms of engagement? How do we make it about ideas and not people? The more comfortable we get with having disagreements, the more we get to tell the truth to each other. The more truth we tell to each other, the more we're actually benefiting from the diversity of ideas and perspectives that we have access to. So I think there's actually some simple, cheap, tactical things that you can do to start centering difference in your organization, your workplace, just by paying attention to disagreement. That's kind of a long rambling answer to your question, Natasha, but hopefully there was something good.
Not rambling at all. It was wonderful. It was incredible. And you got a lot of love in the chat through that whole answer. And I know I want to invite Nika to mention this as well, but I know we talk a lot about both unhealthy disagreement and unhealthy agreement, talking about how, even when we do agree, it can often become toxic and unhealthy. So Nika, if you want to add in on that.
Right.
No, I'm so resonating with what you're sharing with this community, Joe. I was taking notes, and you said you will know you found a different place when you're experiencing discomfort. And I think that so many people are so afraid of discomfort because it feels uncomfortable, and I get it and I know it, but I wish so many more people were to be okay with just embracing that and knowing that there's a lot of power in that place of discomfort. I mean, I think that's where a lot of the biggest aha moments will occur, and the deepened commitment to the hard work takes place when you're able to be uncomfortable, and so I love that. And I think that's really what you are getting a lot of great support from people in the chat that likes what you're sharing. So I know that you've also established a DEI kind of mastermind group. And I just want to talk a little bit about what was the motivation for that, how it's going, and the benefits of it. And I say that as a person who has been able to benefit directly. You generously extended an opportunity for me to be a part of that group. And I think that we need more of that. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I don't think it even qualifies as a mastermind group. It's not quite that as intentional and focused. It's more of a kind of a peer community, but it goes back 16, 17 years. The first time I had an actual organizational D&I leadership role, I knew that I needed a peer group. I had educated myself on the topics. I hadn't been in an organization trying to do the work. And so I knew that I needed people that understood what I was facing, that had resources, that had experience. And I was also in Omaha at that time. And there wasn't, at that time, there weren't very many people in Omaha, Nebraska that had D&I roles. There was like 5 of us. And it started pretty informally. We would get together once a month and have coffee. And sometimes we would talk work, and sometimes we would just laugh together and cry together. We had similar shared experiences. And that was an incredibly valuable group for me. And it's actually still around all of these years later. And it's a kind of a big, crazy, beautiful group today. There's, I think, 250, 300 names on that email list. And we have a monthly meeting with 50 or 60 folks. But I started doing more of those because I had so benefited from it. And we've got a lot of new people coming into this work. We've got a lot of people that work in HR that are trying to help their organization get started. And maybe they don't have the budget to go to a big conference right now, and maybe they don't have any budget, but can we connect them to some people trying to figure out the same things? That's just an incredibly valuable thing to do. And so I've continued to do that, and I think I facilitate 4 of those groups, and they're different shapes and different sizes. But just being able to talk to each other as peers. Here's what I did, and it blew up in my face. Like, that's valuable stuff. You're not going to hear that at a conference.
Right.
This is what blew up in our face, and this is why it blew up in our face. This is how I got my CEO to a different place. This is how we built our first ERG. And here's the paperwork. Like these groups that I'm part of they are beautiful. They're loving and they're sharing. They're not territorial. They're just open books. And I think with so much stuff going on in this work and so many people trying to move their organizations forward, just bringing people together to have a conversation is really, really valuable.
No, I agree. It has been extremely valuable. And I often say that people who are in this space, sometimes it can feel like you're on an island by yourself, right? And this is hard work,
Yep.
especially for those of us who are in this space because we deeply care about the output. If we feel like the progress is being derailed or stalled, that can be very heavy. And so I appreciate just being able to connect
Absolutely.
with others that can share in what we are experiencing as individual practitioners. So I want to talk about.
You and I both know internal leaders.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you and I both know internal D&I leaders who are pretty isolated inside their organization.
Right.
And they also every day feel like they have to be perfect because they don't want to put the work in jeopardy. They don't have a place to let their guard down, to be real, to cry or laugh or swear or whatever they need to do. And so I think it's incredibly valuable that there is a place for that, for folks doing this work.
I agree. So I commend you for making that available for the group that you convene. So I always like to bring in some issues that are top of mind for many people relevant to this broad space of DEI. And we are seeing an upswell of attacks on Asian Americans right now. That's undeniable and certainly needs to be amplified, particularly elderly and women. And so what are your reactions to that? And more specifically, what can others do to be effective allies to ensure the proper attention and support are being given to these issues so that we can really dismantle the racism that's happening among the community of Asian Americans?
Yeah, huge questions there. I don't know that I have anything in the way of an appropriate answer. I do think one of the important things is I think we need to do a better job of sharing these stories and spreading this news, because I think many of us on this call are aware of this because of the networks that we're connected to, because of those conversations, because of the places where we gather. I think there's a whole bunch of people that don't know this is happening, and they're not aware of how frequently hate crimes in general are. And they're not aware of the fact that there are like blatantly bigoted racist people on their school board. They're detached from those realities and those conversations. They don't realize. I'll use myself as an example. If you would have checked in with me when I was 20 years old, not only did I not think that I was racist or capable of being a racist, even though I had racist attitudes and beliefs, I really didn't think it existed anymore. I thought there was, there's a few skinheads on a compound in Idaho somewhere, but other than that, all we have to fix is the unintentional stuff, because that's what my worldview told me. That's what showed up in my news and in the conversations that I was a part of. So I think we see the world very differently than the average person. We're paying attention to different things. We're seeing different information. And so part of it is just in that, making sure that more people are exposed to the reality of this. And I think the more people are exposed to the reality of this, the more people will be intentional about delivering solutions. We clearly need to be having different kinds of conversations in school, high school, junior high, elementary school. We clearly need to be having different kinds of conversations about our history, about the frequency of violence around race and ethnicity and other things in this country. I think in general, I would go so far as to say that we are miseducated about the reality of identity and hate and bigotry in this country from day one, including up to today. Another rambling answer, but it's a complicated thing as well.
No, you're not rambling at all. I appreciate your answer on that. And I think that's the reason that I felt so compelled to, even, in the midst of this community, let's bring it to the fore. Let's make sure that this is on people's radar. And in fact, I would love to just get a quick poll going, if we can, to see prior to today's conversation, who among this community were aware of the upswell of frequent attacks that are occurring right now among Asian Americans. And so we can get that poll going. I will just be interested to hear the reactions of this group. So lots of questions are coming in, and we're going to shift to those questions in just a second. But I have one question, and this is something that we have been dealing with some of the clients that we're working with. And I just want to get your counsel on this and get your response to it. I'm a big fan of people that are really strong allies, and we need more of them, right? We need more of them. Have you ever run into a situation, Joe, with any of your clients where within organizations you had allies that were they were almost the extremist, approach of allyship, to where it was derailing and somehow compromising the efforts of the organization? I'm seeing that right now in one particular situation. I just want to get your thoughts to that. Is there such thing in your mind that you could be too radical with your ally approach that it could, somehow hinder the work?
Probably. I think I would have to know more about the specifics of how that shows up. I know one of the things that I see in the name of allyship is a lot of talk, and not necessarily connected to a lot of action. And I think, and this is something that I struggle with as someone who speaks about this. I think allyship usually isn't about leading the conversation. I think it's about the work in the back room. I think it's about supporting and encouraging and advocating. I see, especially when people are kind of new to the idea of allyship, they're kind of ready to tackle the world and take on everything. And sometimes they take up too much space in the conversation. And I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you're talking about or not, but I think allyship is another one of those things where folks need to be grounded in a common language, and we need to have a conversation about how allyship shows up in behavior. It's not a fashion statement. It's not a stance. It's not a kind of person. Like inclusion, it's a body of work, and there are behaviors and awarenesses and competencies that go into it. And usually that stuff is not about dominating the conversation or even leading the conversation. It usually shows up in different ways. I'm sure there's, I think I like the idea of radical allyship, but it's got to be the right kinds of actions and behaviors, because the folks that have privilege, like, it's safer for them to do this stuff. It's safer for me, if I'm an employee, it's safer for me as the man to say, how are we doing on pay equity? Right? It's safer for me to ask that than it is for someone else to say that. So it's things like that. It's not necessarily being in charge of things.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
No, and I appreciate your answer, because to me, what it highlights is the need to, even from an allyship perspective, to be strategic about what the actions are. And you mentioned taking up too much space. Sometimes that level of forcefulness, it can be a barrier for being able to get the work done. And so I think that, from an allyship perspective, we have to know when to pull back, maybe when to pull forward. When is this a situation where I'm planting a seed and maybe there's someone else to come back and really get it to the next level? But I love your articulation of the fact that sometimes it really is about what's happening in, behind the scenes, not like out in front and center. And I think that's really critical.
Yep.
And I think that, just like inclusion, to be inclusive, you have to be very curious, which I know you've talked about the need to be curious in your work. And I think the same goes for allyship. You can't just assume, I think that this is the best way to be an ally, therefore I'm just going to go and do it. You need to actually ask, how can I be an ally? How can I be there for you, be an advocate and support you, and not just assume and go and do all of these things that could actually cause harm instead of good.
100%. I think curiosity is a huge part of it, and I think also humility is an important part of it. Not only do you need to ask those questions of the folks that you claim to be an ally for, but if you're really an ally, you need to be anchored in accountability to some of those folks. You might have very good intentions. You're still going to make some mistakes. I've probably made mistakes in this conversation, but I've also reached out to folks that I know. Some of them I think are on this call, and said to them, if I say something or do something that lands wrong to you, I want you to know I want that feedback. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to dismiss it. I want you to point that out to me. I think if you want to be an ally, a big part of it is being anchored in very honest conversations and candid feedback with the folks that you claim to be an ally for. Otherwise, you're just chasing stuff on your own. And in spite of your great intentions, you're probably going to make some mistakes and overcomplicate things.
I love
and
that.
I'd love to ask a question kind of in that same vein. So, let's say, Joe, you and I are great friends, and you do something that I think is maybe inappropriate, maybe a little bit racist, and you didn't intend to do so. But I approach you and I say, hey, when you said this, it was a little borderline racist. And I think that, maybe I just wanted to bring it to the forefront. How do you approach the conversation when you tell that person something, and then instead of taking it and using it as feedback, they take it and say, no, you're wrong. That wasn't racist. That wasn't it at all. How do you approach that when it comes with anger instead of, oh, this is a growing opportunity?
And that's the problem, and that's oftentimes how it's received. And so those people stop giving that feedback to that person who thinks that they're an ally, because it ends up being more emotional work for them. And that's why I think as an ally, you have to be intentional about going to some people and saying, I want your feedback. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get defensive. I'm not going to explain it away. I'm going to appreciate the feedback, and I'm going to spend some time with it. I think otherwise, there's always a certain amount of risk involved for the other person. They've got to make an act of courage to give you feedback because they know you might get mad. You might label them as the problem. There's a number of ways that can go wrong. And so, when we sit down and talk about allyship and what it looks like in behaviors, I think that is one of the very most important competencies. You've got to be curious. You've got to be humble. You've got to be open to that feedback. And this is another place where we talk about we've got to get comfortable with discomfort. The reality is it doesn't feel good. Be prepared for that, but receive that stuff and you're going to learn from it. Like most of this, like I read a lot and I go to a lot of workshops. Most of my most valuable lessons have been the products of me making mistakes in front of people who cared. Like there's been no bigger learning device for me in my life. It rarely feels good in the moment, profoundly valuable.
That is so good. And I just want to clarify, I think that when I used the word extremist before, what was coming to mind for me is we do have some people that are well-intended. They really are allies. And I would certainly give them that title. Not that they're giving themselves that title. I would give them that title. But what we're seeing is that because they have such strong convictions in their ally work and advocacy work of certain marginalized populations, it is causing certain individuals who may not be at a certain place within their journey of learning to feel dismissed. So it's that whole council culture conversation that sometimes tends to rise up. And I think that that's where sometimes we have to make sure that from an allyship perspective, we're also grounding ourselves so that we aren't unintentionally creating some additional challenges that could be hindering the work and the total outcome that we're seeking. So there's lots of, feel free to comment on that if you like. If not, there's some great questions into the chat that we want to engage you on. I'm looking at a question now from Tiffany Rose York. And so thank you, Tiffany. Her question is, for folks going out of their own into DEI, justice, anti-racism, what would you tell us not to do, or learnings you could share for us now as DEI practitioners? What would you say to that, Joe?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I can't think of anything top of mind that I would say not to do. I probably have some good things there. I'm not thinking of any. I think, oh gosh, this body of work is so big. There's so much different stuff in it. There's bias, there's psychological safety, there's strategy development, there's bias in technology, there's inclusion in product design and customer experience. It's so big. I think, especially with the energy and attention that's around this work today and the number of new people coming into this work, I think it's probably increasingly important that you're really clear on what piece of the work it is that you do. I think it's harder and harder to do everything. It kind of depends on the client, but I think there's more and more opportunity to specialize on different aspects of the work. And so I think figure out what it is that you're good at, figure out what kinds of things you can solve for organizations. I think just from getting some traction, I think that's a really valuable thing. I know I didn't have a lot of clarity on that when I first started, when I went out on my own. I think for sure be connected to groups of your peers and a mix of different kinds of peers. I think it's very important to be connected to D&I practitioners at different levels and different methodologies. I also think it's valuable, like if we were to look at a competency model for people doing this work, I think the D&I stuff is an important part of it, obviously, and that's what gets most of our attention. But there's some other stuff that's really valuable too. Like, what do you know about change management? Because that's what a whole bunch of this work is. It's change management. It's changing behaviors. It's changing culture. Like, have you been educated on that? Do you have peers? Do you have access to expertise on that? What do you know about political savvy? Because that's what a whole bunch of this work is about. How do things really get done in this organization? How am I going to move? How do I move this person from here to here? Those are as important, I think, as the stuff that we automatically and naturally care about. So I think making sure you have a broad enough set of competencies and having a fair amount of focus on what kinds of things you do or solve, I think that's valuable. I don't know, Nika probably has better answers to this than I do. So
You were on a roll, Joe. I agree with every bit of what you just shared. Those were some really good directional tidbits that I feel like would be of value to anyone that's joined here today. I want to go back and acknowledge the poll that we put forth for those of you who have responded. So far, this audience, 100% of people were aware of the attacks occurring among the Asian American community, and so it's good to know. It's good to know. So we all are aware. Natasha, would you like to present the next question?
Yep.
Absolutely. So the next question came in from Diana Lee, and she asked, Joe, for those of us that are not white and not American born, but were indoctrinated early with racist information, what advice do you have for us to learn the reality of DEI in the U.S.? Getting some hard-hitting questions.
Yeah.
Such good questions today. Yes, such good questions. That's a great question. This will be another incomplete answer. For me, I had to go back and study history. I learned probably in my mid-30s as a high school graduate, as a college graduate. I came to realize that I did not know the reality of the history of race in this country. I did not know the reality of slavery. I did not know the reality of Jim Crow. I did not know the reality of the civil rights movement. And I also didn't know the reality of the women's movement in this country or the gay rights movement. So I had to spend a whole bunch of time going back and educating myself on history. And that's easier to do than ever before. There's a ton of really good books out there. There's some documentaries out there. But for me, that was a big part of it. I had to spend a lot of time studying and learning how racism was baked into everything in this country from the get-go. And it's funny because when I started down that road, I thought I was a person that kind of got it. And I knew bits and pieces of it. Like I knew what redlining was and I knew some other things, but one organization I will applaud is the Racial Equity Institute, REI. They do a fantastic job of cracking this open for people and in a fairly short period of time. If you spend, I've only gone through one of their programs, but it was 2 days or a day and a half. And I went into this as a person who I've read some books and I think I get it. And I was blown away at some of what they pointed out to me about our own history, about the racial consequences of things that we look like as not being racist in nature, like the GI Bill and some of the things that happened in the 40s and the 50s. For me, that's the biggest answer to the question. I had to go back and learn history. And I think the other answer was I had to know Black folks. I had to have real relationships with Black folks where they felt safe telling their story to me, what the kinds of things that they experience, the kinds of things that their families experience, the kinds of things that were in their story. Those two things were proven to be very valuable to me in learning it. And I don't claim that I'm an expert on the topic yet, but I have a much greater appreciation and understanding of it than I used to.
And I agree. There's a miseducation when it comes to our schooling systems and our students. And you alluded to this earlier on. And I hear a lot when people talk about not wanting to embrace these things in schools is that, they're only children, they're just kids. But at the same time, we can teach the Holocaust, which we should, and it's very important. But we also know that students and kids understand race at a very young age. I mean, you look at Jane Elliott's blue eyes, brown eyes test, you look at the Brown versus Board doll test, and from a very early age, kids understand race and they understand it and they can comprehend it, but we still shy away from those conversations and really just portray other things such as the Holocaust, which were awful, but we neglect our own internal issues.
Or we allow students and parents to
and I think even just the history. Oops, sorry.
No, you're fine, Joe. I think there may be a slight delay, so you're totally fine. But I was just saying, or we may, allow people to opt out, students and parents to opt out. I mean, we've seen that as well, which is, it's disturbing. But nonetheless, go ahead and share your point that you wanted to bring up.
Absolutely. I was also going to point out it's important to just understand, to be really well educated on what race actually is. It's important to be educated on the history of the idea of race, because that's not a thing that's always been around. That was a thing that we created along the way and used it in very specific ways. And so I think understanding that gives you a very different perspective on this country and the consequences of race. And again, Racial Equity Institute is a good resource for that. Another good resource, there's a podcast called Scene on Radio, and Scene is spelled SCENE. Really well done podcast. They did a whole season on gender and masculinity that was fantastic, but they did a whole series on the concept of whiteness, the history of the idea of whiteness. It's 10 or 12 episodes. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks so much, Joe. And REI is an incredible resource. I placed it into the chat if someone could also get the link to their website, but it is a great resource. So we're going to go to another question from one of our audience members. And this question is coming from Kyra McDonald. Thank you, Kyra, for your question. What's your advice on talking to white cis men about diversity? My experience has been that so many feel threatened and defensive. Who's best positioned to have those conversations? Is it other white men? Have you had experience with talking with people from a place of feeling threatened and defensive to a place of awareness and willingness to engage?
Yeah, more really good questions. I think, and it depends. People are at a lot of different places, and so some of this is if you have the opportunity to get to know the person a little bit, I think you can be a little bit more effective. The tool that's been most effective for me in engaging cis white men in this conversation is me sharing my own story, talking about where I started off, what kinds of experiences I've had along the way, being honest about the fact that I had clearly and obviously racist ideas and beliefs that I didn't even acknowledge as racist. I had clearly sexist ideas and beliefs that I didn't acknowledge. I was blatantly, proudly homophobic earlier in my life, sharing some of those things and then talking a little bit about some of what changed for me along the way. Sometimes I think one of the things that gets in our way is language. When someone sat down with me and tried to convince me that I had privilege, I was deeply offended, which is hysterical because I'm literally dripping with privilege. You would have a hard time finding a more privileged person than me, but I was very offended because of what I thought they were saying. I thought they were saying that because of who I was, everything had been given to me, and that wasn't my experience, but that's not what they were saying. But I had some ideas about what privilege meant. Part of the problem is those ideas. White men maybe have different ideas about what you mean when you say the word diversity, because some podcaster has told them that diversity means getting rid of all the white men. So that's what they think that you're talking about. You're not, but that's what they think you're talking about. So common language, again, is valuable. When I say these words, when I say bias, when I say race, when I say racism, this is what I mean. A lot of times when I see or observe those exchanges, those arguments, they're not talking about the same thing. They're talking about very different ideas of what privilege or bias or racism is. So I think those are a few things. Be careful and intentional with the language that you use. I try to draw those people into conversations rather than do too much of the talking. I try to ask questions. I try to approach it as a student, ask open-ended questions. Where does that belief come from? Is that a lived experience, or did you hear that from somebody else? Asking big open-ended questions makes them do a better job of justifying their approach or their idea, and a lot of it at some point kind of falls short. And so that's more effective a lot of times than me trying to beat them to death with facts. I used to do that. Like I've probably, like Nika, I've collected all the facts. I have all the business case stuff. I've got all the studies, and I will beat you senseless with data and facts. And I think it's valuable to have that. Data and facts don't change people's hearts and minds. Stories, listening, being heard, those are the kinds of things that change people's hearts and minds. And I think some people need to hear it from someone that looks like them. And I think some people need to hear it from someone else. And there's, Nika, you probably know Polly Massey. Like she's gifted. That is a gifted woman. I've seen her stand in a room full of white men, and she told them the truth, and they took it. And that's not everybody has that skill set. Not everybody can be heard in that way, but there are people, I think I'm really good at connecting to other middle-aged white men. I think not all middle-aged white men need to hear from middle-aged white men. So I don't think there's one right answer, because we're all put together different. We're on a different place on our journey. But I think being intentional about the person, about how you have the conversation. And I think the hardest part is like not getting emotional. These conversations activate big, powerful emotions. And I think when we're in an emotional place, even if it's valid, like we don't always pick the best tools. Sometimes the thing that feels best and maybe might be truest for me to say, you're a racist. It might be true and it might feel good. It's rarely effective. Like there's probably a more effective tool if what I want to do is move the conversation forward.
Right. No, I love that. I want to introduce another resource that I think this community would gain value from knowing about, especially as we're talking about trying to appeal to white cis men who may not engage in this conversation in a way that helps them to really be able to move the needle forward. And that is White Men as Full Diversity Partners. Bill Proudman is the founder of that group. And it really is focused on helping those, white men in positions of power and influence that really can help change the landscape of this work to get engaged and have the perspective that's needed. So I wanted to share that. Again, his name is Bill Proudman. And the organization is called White Men as Full Diversity Partners. So you're familiar with them? Sounds like you are, Joe.
Absolutely. And I endorse them as well. And I think, I think a lot of times there is some value in gathering groups of white men together. For a variety of reasons. They haven't been as actively involved in this conversation, and they're at a different place. And they have, there's a better way to say this, they have some stupid things to say. They have some questions to ask, and they're scared to say those things out loud. And we're never going to have that conversation if they won't just say them out loud. And so sometimes I think it is important to have, this is a very safe place. It's just all people that look like each other. Like, let's work through that stuff. Ask the question. For the love of God, ask the question out loud so that we can have the conversation. Because, most of our diversity inclusion sessions, they should be the most honest conversations that we have, and they're not. The people won't ask the questions so often. They're afraid of saying something wrong, and we've got to get at those conversations.
Yeah,
comes back to that being curious, asking intentional questions comes back to that.
Yeah.
Well, moving to our next question, and also wanted to highlight that the first question you answered about the what not to do, Tiffany said, "Thank you, Joe. That was so guiding for me. Really appreciate you sharing your recommendations." So she appreciated your response. But our next question comes from Zoe. She said, "How did you use external consultants when you worked in a company to support D&I initiatives?"
I used diverse external consultants in a couple of ways to help us build our strategy, because I'd never gone through that process before. And so I very much wanted some external expertise on that. We also brought in some external consultants to do a couple of specific things. So the organization that I led diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency in was a regional healthcare system. And so we were trying to sort through some things that were specific to the demographic data that we collected when patients came into the organization, what we did with that data. That was a little bit more industry specific. We also brought in a little bit of training, and I think the training was cultural competency for nurses and or doctors. That was, I think, the extent of external consultants that I used in that role. But there's a lot of different in a kind of an exploding ecosystem of consultancies out there. And like practitioners, they have different skill sets and different focuses and different methodologies. Just know that there's a lot of options out there. Get clear on what it is that you need solved. And I think that helps you find the right provider. One of the things that's kind of interesting as someone who provides outside services, and this is another way in which organizations, they don't really get this stuff yet, especially organizations that are starting off. And again, there's probably a better way to say most of what I'm saying, but I oftentimes will get asked to come in and make a presentation. And when I say, what's your objective? Most organizations don't have an objective. They want me to give the objective and the solution. And I think when most organizations hire folks to do strategy development or customer service, I think they have an objective in mind. They're trying to solve something. And so that's another way in which organizations are feeling the need to do something, and so they want to have activity, but they don't even have clarity on what it is that they're trying. What's the objective? What should the consequence of this effort be? Is there going to be a behavior that we start or stop? Like, what's the consequence of this? If you're an internal leader, everything that you should do should have a consequence. There should be something that's going to be different because of this group, this program, this effort. We keep getting dinged. You'll keep seeing these clickbaity articles and blog things about how diversity training doesn't work. Well, it's a much bigger, more complicated conversation than that. Some diversity training works really, really well. The problem is a lot of diversity training isn't built towards a specific consequence. Right. It's awareness stuff. Here's what you need to know. Awesome. But Is anything going to be different? Is the world going to be in some way different because we gathered, we went over this material, we built this group? There should be consequences for everything. I think a lot of organizations, especially early on, they just want to build stuff. They just want to have activity. And some of the stuff that they build is probably very good and well, but they don't necessarily have a consequence. The employees aren't going to feel any different a year later because this thing happened.
That is so good, Joe. You have really shared so much great information with us today. You're getting a lot of appreciation and love into the chat. And I do want to make sure that we draw everyone's attention to the chat. There's lots of great resources. People are sharing their LinkedIn information. So definitely see this as a community to learn with and from each other, even beyond today's session. Well, we are out of time, and the hour has gone by so fast because it was just that rich. Joe, we're so appreciative. We're appreciative of you sharing your insight, your expertise, your knowledge, and we just look forward to continuing to support your work. And we're grateful that you took the time to share with us today. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you, Natasha, for serving in this role with me today, and to all of our teammates that are helping behind the scenes. But yes, we want to give you the last word. Is there anything that we have not asked you about that you want this audience to know as we close out our time?
A couple of upcoming events I'll plug in, and this audience might already know about them. The Return on Inclusion Summit is coming up February 25th and 26th. Great event, fantastic lineup. It's almost like a family reunion. The Forum for Workplace Inclusion, a really good, well-rounded diversity conference is a couple of weeks later, March 9th, I think.
Yes, that's
good
correct.
Resources, good content, also good opportunity to connect to peers.
No, I love that.
We'll all be at Return on Inclusion.
Yes, I was just going to say those are two opportunities that actually the NWC team are participating in. So we look forward to that. And the link to that is provided in the chat. So you will receive the chat transcript as well as other tidbits that we have taken note of that have been some really good takeaways we want to remember. So you will receive that in a follow-up email this afternoon, as well as a replay of today. So thank you again, Joe. Thank you all for sharing with us, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.